Very good afternoon to everybody. It's Saturday afternoon, Conversations from Lockdown with myself, Aidan. This is brought to you by Kyalami Park Equestrian in association with Mumpro SA I4 Williams Horsebox Trailers, our new sponsor. Please go check out their Facebook page as well as their website. Well, something a little bit different this afternoon. We have been chatting to primarily riders from different disciplines in this series. We did have one chat at the beginning of the series talking about African horse sickness with Professor Guthrie on the challenges of AHS, and something a little bit different this afternoon. Once again, we move away from riders and we're talking nutrition. And my guest this afternoon from Equus Feeds is Hannah Botha. How are you, Hannah?
I'm good, thank you, Aidan. How are you?
I'm very well, thank you.
Good.
Before we get into it, Equus Feeds and RCA Feeds and Epol all under one umbrella, which happened a little while ago, a year or two back. Tell us about that. That's
correct. Equus has always traditionally been, a company run by itself. We were a smaller company and set good feet into the industry. And then 2 years ago, RCL Foods bought out Equus to put it under the same umbrella as the Epol brand. So now we're running under that one umbrella as the two side by side, which has actually been a really great marriage so far. The nicest thing about it is now when we're heading out to see the clients, we've got such a huge basket of things to be able to offer everybody, depending, right from start to finish, from stud to top performance. We've got absolutely everything we could need under one heading. So it's been a really nice joining of the two companies, and it's been a great 2 years so far.
So Debbie Dick was heading up Epol, and then Equus was on your side. Have you now had to learn about the Epol brand? I suppose it's not too much to learn food. I suppose you'll pick it up quickly if you have that mindset. But are you marketing Equus and Epol, or are you just under Equus?
No, absolutely. We do the whole thing together. We're working as one big team. We don't see ourselves as two different companies. We see ourselves now as the one. So we are really there for anybody, whether you're using Epol or Equus. We're there to help you with your horses and to help with the products. So it's been a learning curve in terms of learning how the products work for different people, because that's also an important part of giving people advice, is not only going with what works on paper, but also the things that work in practice. So it's also just becoming familiar with products that, we hadn't used. But I've been working in the industry since 2007. So, you get to know all the products on the market. It's not just your own brand that you end up getting to know. You get to have all the details of those other products as well.
Mm-hmm. Tell us a bit about yourself, your background, your schooling, and how you came to find yourself in South Africa working for a feed company specializing in equine nutrition. What got you there?
Yeah, well, I originally come from the UK, so I grew up and studied in the UK as well. I did a degree in equine science at Hartpury College, which is a fantastic place, and has got bigger and better over the years. They have a huge amount of competitions now within the UK and host a lot of events, which is great. I then went on and did my master's in equine science at the Royal Agricultural College, and during that year I then met my now husband, who's South African, and so I followed him back and haven't gone back since. So yeah, I started, that was really for me the best thing. I started riding at about age 6. And so I've always loved horses. So being able to go and do a degree was, the best thing for me, was to be able to follow that through and, train in something official as well as just the love of horses. So, yeah, that's how I came to South Africa, and it's been fantastic. I actually started out working at Medfeeds. Simon was very gracious to give me a job, having never met me before, all the way from the UK. So I worked there to get a feel for the industry, and then I met the owners of Equus there, and moved across. And then, as I said, 2 years ago, RCL purchased Equus as well, and now I run with Epol too. So it's been a very busy sort of 13 years here. And yeah, it's been good. I love working in South Africa. The people are fantastic, and the weather obviously is much better than the UK.
Perfect. Now let's get on to these animals that we love so much, the horse. It has to be said, not the greatest design in terms of stomach, causes a lot of problems. The fact that they're not able to regurgitate makes them so susceptible to colics. So in this time of COVID, obviously, you know what's going on, and a lot of the yards are locked down. A lot of the horses haven't been able to get the work, the sport horses, that is, the work that they normally get. Has that not caused any problems? And some advice to people in this time of COVID when it comes to feeding their horses?
Well, I think from the people that we've seen and for the clients that we have, I think it's been a bit of a mixed, bag in terms of colics. I think some vets in particular have often said they're seeing more, some say seeing less. And I think it really depends on the type of horse. For example, I'm seeing, especially in my more competition type animals, I'm seeing actually a lot less colics in those competition horses. I think because they're at home, they're a bit more relaxed, they're maybe getting a bit more turnout than they were getting before. They don't have that stress and that worry, which can sometimes bring on your colics. They're also maybe not being fed so much because they're not competing, they're not getting such large volumes of food. And so from those sort of horses, we are seeing less colics. But then you've got the 1 or 2 horses that are very prone to colic. And because they're out of their routine, because they're not getting the work that they normally do, which can, assist with keeping the guts moving along nicely, they tend to be having a few more problems. So from that point of view, I can't say it's been one way or the other. But I think generally, horses are a little bit more relaxed perhaps than they were. And I think it's also spurred people to think outside the box and do different things with their training. So a lot of people are doing things that they wouldn't have done normally in their ridden work, which I think has actually been a nice change for the horses, because you're starting to see them, enjoying their work again, not getting bogged down in the same thing. In terms of feeding, again, we did a Facebook Live session 2 weeks ago about how to feed your horse in lockdown, and it's very individual. There's no one blanket way of going with. Each horse is so very different, but generally the trend has been a lot less work is being done. Horses are not being, or at the beginning of lockdown anyway, horses were not doing as much work as they normally do. So we've seen a lot of people needing to reduce their concentrate feed, making sure that their roughage component, their fiber portion, is really up there and they're feeding a good amount of hay. And then with some people who've had to reduce their concentrates drastically, feeding something like a balancer product to make sure your vitamin and minerals and your daily essentials are kept up. And then we've had the opposite end of the spectrum, where actually now horses are doing more work. The owners are able to be at home. The horses are at home. They're not out at work every day. So the horses are actually doing a lot more work than they were doing previously. So for those horses, we've looked at, can we stay on the same product, but just increase the quantity a little bit to give them that extra energy that they need? Or do we need to look at a higher energy feed now, if they were maybe on just a regular maintenance or leisure type product previously? So it's really been a little bit of a mix depending on how people's lockdown have gone, and whether you're on a yard or a home.
Let's talk about, go right back to the basics. Let's discuss nutrition. What do we know about the horse, the way it works, the way it, in its natural state, would be feeding? We then take it out of its natural state, put it in stables, confine it for certain hours of the day, and these obviously present challenges because essentially we're going against the grain of its natural design. So let's go right back to the basics and tell me about the horse. How was it designed? What have we done? What do we now have to do to try and prevent the associated problems of domestication?
Yeah, well, I mean, the horse is has a very simple digestive system, so it doesn't like to be overloaded with a whole range of things. And if you left the horse to its own devices out in the wild, would be eating a high fiber diet. That's what they're designed to eat. That's what they should be eating. And so we always say to anybody when we're looking at products, that's fiber, and more fiber. So your hay, your grazing, chaff products, beet type products, any of those should be the basis of the diet. And if you've got those sort of things right, you're feeding for your horse's gut health. You're keeping the gut healthy. You're keeping it moving along. And especially in South Africa where the grazing is not always so good, the reliance on hay becomes much more. So make sure you've got that long fiber moving through the digestive system to keep everything happy and healthy. You know, in a sort of more wild situation, the horse would be a trickle feeder. So they eat small bits all the time. They generally don't have large periods of time when they're not getting anything. And so again, if we take that and put it in a more domestic situation, that means keeping your meal size small, keeping it under 2.5 kilos a meal, and trying to feed more often. So if you're needing to feed larger quantities, feeding 4-5 meals a day rather than just one. Keeping those meal size smalls is very important, especially if you've got a horse with colic. And then making sure your horse is not standing at any point in time with no food or no hay, especially at any point. You know, hay should always be freely available. It has the added bonus, especially for horses that suffer with ulcers, is that it has it helps the horse create more saliva. Horses only produce saliva when they chew. So if we keep a horse producing saliva, the saliva will help buffer the stomach acid as well, which will help keep ulcers at bay. So if your horse is in a stable, making sure that they're always having ad lib hay is really the best way to go to keep that gut working as it would do in a sort of more natural situation, and really using your concentrate as a way to top up the daily essentials in terms of vitamins and minerals and that extra energy that they need from the imposed work that we're now putting on them. So for me, it's about keeping everything simple, starting off with the basics of good hay, making sure it's in good amounts, and then just adding small amounts of concentrates that will cover exactly what the horse needs and not overdoing it, which can cause an issue or a problem.
You use the word hay. In South Africa, we get different types. Eragrostis, teff, lucerne, oat hay, red grass, the more common ones. All have varying different amounts of protein, sugar. A horse in work. So as you said earlier on, each horse is an individual. Each has its own makeup. Each metabolism is different. So we're going to have to generalize in this conversation. But take us through some of the different types of hay and what they provide in terms of nutritional value and content.
Yeah, I mean, as you say, we kind of have to sort of do a sort of generalized statement, because also not only does each hay differ, but also depending on how the hay was grown, harvested, the time that it was harvested, whether it was under irrigation or not, can be quite different. So, you know, depending on all of those things, it can be a little bit changeable. But I mean, if we have a look at your Eragrostis and your teffs, they're generally the most widely used products, or the most widely used hays that people have on most yards. And generally, they're nice grasses to be able to feed for anybody. They have a relatively sort of stable protein content. In other words, they don't range too much. For example, protein in the lucerne can range from 13% right up to 25% in some cases. So it has a big variability, whereas your teff and Eragrostis tend to stick in a little bit more of a set range, and usually sort of between 9 and 10% in terms of the protein. In terms of sugars, your teff and Eragrostis have again a more stable sugar content. It's not particularly high, and can therefore be used for the majority of horses, even for those that need to have a little bit more of a sugar sensitive diet. Lucerne for me is a great product. I do like using lucerne. I know a lot of people, you know, it's not their go-to, but it's a lovely product to use for especially performance horses that maybe need slightly high calories, a little bit more protein in their diet. So for example, stud horses, it's a great option for. And the other reason I often recommend lucerne is it has an acid buffering capacity. So again, for horses with ulcers, it's a great thing to add in the diet because it actually helps with buffering that acid. And so usually we recommend to feed lucerne before each meal for those high risk ulcer horses. And then you've got your oat hay, which is one of the slightly more trickier hays in terms of feeding because of its sugar content. The sugar and starch content of oat hay is quite high. And so for horses with things like laminitis or insulin resistance, it really would be one that we try and avoid because, you know, it's even with soaking, it's very difficult to get rid of that sugar content. Lucerne surprisingly has a relatively low sugar content, and it actually can be used for horses with different issues, but it does have a much higher calorie content, which again, if you've got a horse that puts on weight very easily, it might not be the kind of one that you want to look at. But if you're looking at increasing your weight, Lucerne is a good option. In terms of recommending hays, we generally stick with your teff and Aerogrossus just because it can cover more horses. You know, in a big yard situation where you've got 60 horses, those two grasses are going to be more suitable for the average. And then you can bring in the others as and when you need. So for example, Lucerne, due to its calcium and phosphorus imbalance, you can feed up to about 50% in total of your horse's roughage. So if your horse is supposed to have 8 kilos, you wouldn't really want to feed much more than 4 kilos of Lucerne. So really the Lucerne and Ote we bring in as and when we might need it, and sticking with the other grasses, even things like Rhodes and red grass, as a more sort of general coverage, and then the other two for more specific needs.
Let's now talk a bit about the various grasses. You mentioned Lucerne, and has great properties. It's higher in calories. Would that be first of all, where do those calories come from? I would have thought that maybe teff was higher in calories. Obviously not so. Would that be part of the reason why some horses react to Lucerne? When I say react, you give them some Lucerne and the next day they're unplayable. My experience, some do, some don't. So what is the reason for that?
Well, generally your calories is coming from your digestible fiber portion. And that digestible fiber portion is in your leaf material. So when you take a teff, for example, if it's been cut at a particular stage, and you've got a lot of leaf portion, then you'd have a lot of digestible fiber, which is where your calories and your energy is going to come from. And the same applies with Lucerne. Generally, when you have Lucerne cut, you get a lot of that leafy, fine material, and that's where your digestible fiber is. In the stem portion, you've got your undigestible fiber, and that's not very usable for the horse. So generally, when you have teff cut, you don't get that leaf portion. You're just getting the more stemmed portion, which is your more indigestible fiber. So it's not giving you as much of the energies and calories as a very high leaf ratio hay would. And that is where your Lucerne comes in, because you get all of that leaf portion as well. And, you know, your protein is coming from the fact that Lucerne is actually a legume plant, not just a grass. So you've got that, the difference in that. But yeah, I mean, again, I think it's very individual. It comes down to the individual horse and how well they digest things and how usable they find using the fiber portion of the diet. Because as you say, some horses seem to be a lot hotter than others, you know, when they get Lucerne. But I think it also, you know, comes in terms of context of where the Lucerne comes into the diet. So for example, if you've got a horse on a lot of concentrates, getting, you know, a good amount of hay, maybe more hay than they generally need, good amount of concentrates, and then you add Lucerne on top of that, if their energy needs were being met by 100% with all the ordinary hay and food, and then you add Lucerne on, you're now meeting that horse's energy needs by 110, 120%. And so you are going to get that more explosive behavior. Whereas if you know you want to add Lucerne into the diet for a reason, like for ulcers we were talking about and saying it's a good thing for that, then we'll take that into account. So you would drop maybe the other hays that you're using a little bit to compensate for that, the Lucerne coming in. You might drop your concentrates a little bit for the Lucerne coming in, so that the total amount of energy per day is spot on, and we're not giving that excess, which would cause the horses to become a little bit hot. So I think sometimes it's more about the context than actually about the Lucerne itself. And as you say, sometimes it does get a bit of a bad rep, because we see that it's high in protein and we assume that the horse is going to get the energy from protein. And to some extent, the horse can digest protein and take energy from that, but it's a very inefficient process and it costs a lot for the body to do that. And so horses don't naturally revert to that unless they have to. I mean, if we're not providing energy from carbohydrates and fiber and fat, and they don't have any other choice, they will convert the protein that they're getting into energy. But as long as those other sources are not provided, because they will be the go-to for the body, because they're much simpler and easier to digest and use. So I think again, it comes down to how well the horse is digesting ingredients and how well they digest fiber and how much they can pull out of it. I mean, we know that between good doers and bad doers. Good doers are very efficient at taking everything out of what they get, whereas your poorer doers are maybe not quite efficient at doing that.
Mm. Could we use a general rule to say, well, if you've got a really hot-blooded horse, then Eragrostis would be your go-to grass? If you've got a horse with medium type energy that you'd want to have a little bit more vum in the tank, then perhaps Teff is your go-to grass. And if you got, if you want to put more engine in the tank, or if you've got a bit of a lazy guy, then you would have Teff and supplement with a bit of Lucerne. Is it as simple as that, or again, it comes down to the individual? Because I've also found that some horses react terribly to Teff. Like some of my string, if I put them on Teff, they'll be fine on the Lucerne, but I put them on the Teff and it pops their lid.
Well, again, I mean, that's where we came back to saying before, you know, each bale is different, each depending on where your Teff's coming from. I mean, I always say, you know, people often say, you know, should I feed Teff or Eragrostis? And I always say, well, you know, a good Eragrostis is going to be better than a bad Teff. And if you've got a really great Teff, then, you know, use that instead. So the two are quite similar. They don't range much, but it's coming down to how they've been grown and how well they've been grown. Is it irrigated? Not. All of those factors play a big part. So I think, you know, you can sort of use that blanket sort of coverage, and that's kind of what we do. It's kind of sort of the breakdown we go for. But I think the most important thing, and especially during winter time, is really what can you get in good supply that's good quality, it's not dusty, moldy, that you can get enough supply of. Because it's all very well saying, okay, great, your horse is more suited to Lucerne or Teff or Eragrostis, but if you can't get it at a particular time of the year, then you're going to chop and change and up and down, and that in itself is never going to be, you know, ideal for the horse. So I always say, what can you get that suits your budget, that you can buy enough of to feed it in good quantity, and that is going to be available for most of the year where you are, and that you can get, because just chopping and changing is never going to be good. But yes, I mean, you could follow those sort of rule of thumb, you know, but again, looking at the individual is always going to be better. Treating your horse as an individual rather than trying to make him fit in with everybody else is going to put you in good stead for getting exactly what you want out of your horse.
Mm. Let's talk about sugar contents in these grasses. I want to complete with all the grasses. What is the relationship between sugar and horses? Is it a bad relationship? Is it as bad as the relationship between sugar and humans, or sugar and dogs? Or again, are horses more or less susceptible to the effects of sugar? And what are those effects?
No, I think again, you know, sugar does get a bit of a bad rep, and it's sort of become the trend, especially, you know, sort of overseas, to go on the lower sugar diet. And there are some horses that really do need a low sugar diet. So your laminetics, your insulin resistant, your metabolic problems, you know, they do need to have a lower sugar content. But for the average horse, you know, sugar is not a bad thing. Sugar is there to provide them with energy. It's a quick go-to source, and so is starch, which is your cereal grains. Those two in combination are an easy go-to source of energy for the average horse. And at the end of the day, you do need some sugar and some carbs in the diet. It's what the brain will use to function. So it's not that you want to restrict your sugar completely. You don't want to take it out completely. But it's, you know, it does have its place, but it also needs to be sort of kept on the side of caution for those horses that do have an issue with it. There's been, I think there was one study done in Australia to say that, you know, sugar in some hays, for example, I think they used oat hay as an example, can cause increased cavities in horses, just like it does in humans. But that was just, you know, the one study in one paper. So it's very difficult to say whether that would be, you know, an issue across the board. And again, because hays fluctuate from area to area, from country to country, it would be very difficult to know without knowing what then the nutritional value of their oat hay would be. So I think sugar gets a bad rep. And definitely it doesn't need to be something that we fear. Horses do need to have sugar. And even in low sugar products for laminetics and things like that, you still have to have some sugar in there to give them that extra. So we can't ban it completely. And obviously if your horse is grazing, they're going to be getting the sugars from the grass anyway. So it's really about limiting where we need to, and not worrying about it so much for the average horse, because they handle it very well. And, you know, unless you've got a horse with a sensitivity to it. And some horses are more sensitive, you know, like kids, like adults, you know, you have a bit too much sugar and they don't handle it so well. And most people get to know whether that's the case for their horse or not. But no, I don't. I think over the years we've become a bit more frightened of it, but actually it's something that we should embrace. And as long as we're doing it in moderation, is no problem at all.
And it is, like you say, down to the individual. Some will react, and it's a very quick release energy, isn't it? I mean, once they eat it, it's like drinking a Coke or a kid with a Lucozade. You'll see it go, you know.
Exactly. And so for certain situations, the same applies to cereal grains. And so for certain disciplines, that has a huge advantage. So for your race horses, that has a big advantage, gives them the instant access energy that they need to reach their maximum potential. You know, to some extent in your endurance horses, the endurance horses need a more low GI base to run for long periods of time, but they also need that boost every now and then of something with a higher you know, sugar starch content to give them that boost to refuel and go forward. So again, it depends on the discipline. You know, I find generally your leisure horses, those not doing very much work, you could go on a much higher fiber fat diet and the horses will do very well. And then you've got the horses competing at their maximum potential that do need a bit of sugar and starch to really keep those energy reserves up and make sure they've got enough for the next day.
In terms of the three grasses, the teff, the Erogrostis, and the Lucerne, and the energy content of each, if you were looking for a horse who was down on energy, you were at a class and you want to get your best out of horses between classes. I jumped the first class, a horse is feeling a little bit lethargic, want to boost him up, got a couple of hours to play. What would I be doing between those classes just to get the energy level up for the next one?
Yeah, I mean, you can look at doing it through your grasses by providing more of your normal grass. So for example, you'll find some horses, they go to show and they'll eat a lot more because they are hungry. They'll eat between classes. And it makes it very easy. You can just make sure that their teff, their Erogrostis is available at all times, and they'll just refuel and reboost. It's also why I find for some horses, you know, going with a meal for lunchtime, keeping to their regular meals is also the best way to make sure that they're refueled for the afternoon. I mean, if you have a horse that you know particularly lags a little bit, you can either increase your food or feed a more carb-rich diet at, say, lunchtime. If you know you're competing in the afternoon, feed something with a slightly higher starch and sugar content at that lunchtime meal to sort of boost them up. But then you would look towards maybe more using a little bit more Lucerne during your competition time if it's something that your horse is able to handle without being, too much. But again, for me, going to competitions, you don't want to change anything massively from home. You don't want to be adding in meals that the horse never missed. And so if it is your plan to add something like that in during a competition, it's always worth having a little bit of it at home as well. So, if at home we've got a particular product called the Epol Speed Max, the Epol and the Equus Race and Replace, both of those are high energy booster mixes. And we often recommend those for horses that need a bit of a boost during competition. But if you're going to be using those, we always say use a small amount at home every day so that it's in the diet, it's not something new. And then when you go to a competition, just simply increase it. And I think that would apply to your haze as well. Don't make major changes at competition. If you're going to feed a little bit of Lucerne during competition, then feed a little bit at home. It can be a lot less than you would during competition, but make sure it's always there in the diet, that you don't have that problem of adding something in suddenly one day and then not the next, which can also be, do more harm than good.
The general equation as to how much forage a horse should be eating every day. First of all, what is that equation? And is it a hard and fast rule, or is it, again, the individual comes into play?
No, well, generally we recommend an absolute minimum of 1.5% of body weight in hay per day. So for a 500 kilo horse, that's about 7.5 kilos minimum per day. Obviously there's a bit of moisture content in that. So I generally sort of add another little bit on top, another kilo. So we say about 8.5 kilos a day for a 500 kilo horse. And that's generally a fairly set hard and fast rule. There are some exceptions to that. If you've got a horse that puts on huge amounts of weight as an exceptional doer, we might restrict the hay to 1%, but that would really be an absolute minimum. And then there are other horses, for example, your stud animals, that are going to need more, and we might increase that to 2% per day, so 10 kilos for a 500 kilo horse. But generally, for your average, 1.5% of body weight per day per horse is a fairly set rule that you can use. If you don't want to restrict your horses that much, then going with ad lib. But ad lib literally means eating as much as they want. So it would be constantly in there. I find sometimes people think they're doing ad lib, but then there's big gaps of the day where the horse is standing without anything because they've eaten it, and it hasn't been replenished. So ad lib, really does mean absolutely 24/7 availability to hay, and that can be quite achievable if you've got the big round bales, because you can leave that out if the horse is staying out, for example, and get that. But when it's in a bit more of a stable situation, it's quite more high maintenance to do the ad lib, because you've got to constantly make sure that someone's going in to top it up and refill.
Right, now this brings us on to the big P word, protein. And this often there's a lot of misinformation about protein with regard to horses, how much they need. So if you can clear up a few things for us in terms of relative size to the amount of protein, what is a horse needing? Is it true that it needs relatively quite substantially less than, say, a human being would need in terms of their body to weight ratio and how much they're eating?
Yeah, I mean, we go again with the guidelines of the Nutritional Council, the NRC, and they have a whole, breakdown of the individual protein requirements for horses at different ages and different disciplines and stages as well. So obviously, the bigger your horse is, the generally also the more protein they're going to need, but also the age is going to play a big part. So, for example, your younger horses need a slightly higher level of protein in their diet per day than your older horses, or than your adult horses. And also mares, for example, who are lactating and feeding a foal, they're going to need a higher protein content than the average adult horse anyway. Again, it's very variable. So to give you figures, I'd have to get out my book. I don't have those all in my head. But for the average adult horse in light work, we can generally cover their protein needs from hay and grazing alone. And it's something we often forget. We often think that the food has to cover everything. And if you're feeding the correct amount of forage, it should be covering the majority of your protein content per day anyway. And then the concentrate food is there just to give a little bit of a top up and a little bit of extra. So for the average horse, you can cover their needs very simply and easily. And I think that's one thing that we do tend to overdo. We add in nice amount of hay, we throw a little bit of lucerne in, then we add a couple of kilos of concentrates, and then we might even add a balancer on top, and it's just more protein, and more protein. And quite often the horse doesn't need that quantity. And the horse will simply get rid of it. So for me, if you're overdoing your protein, the horse is just simply going to excrete it. And it's quite an expensive product. So I do find that when we try and feed for maybe muscle gain and we're adding in a lot of protein, if we're overdoing it, it's not going to build more muscle. It's just going to be, it's just not going to be used. So you can't almost sort of load it in there. It's the horse is just going to take what it needs per day, and so adding in more and more extra to try and achieve a muscle building effect, I don't always find is very desirable. So making sure you're doing a good quality diet that covers a good quality protein is the better thing to go, rather than the amount of protein. Find a food, a brand that is really focusing on their protein levels, making sure that the amino acid levels, which are the building blocks of your protein, are there. And it's often what is limiting in terms of the equine diet. So finding a company that's focusing on that rather than just going for a 14% or a 16%, find a good quality protein that you can put into your horse's diet to make sure that you're not overdoing it.
You touched on the percentage. Let's talk about that first before I go on to my next question. So at 10%, for some people don't really know what this means. A 10% protein means within each kilo, 100 grams would be protein. At 12%, exactly. 120 grams protein, and that's the way it goes. What is the correlation, if any, between protein and energy? because, and I ask that because a lot of people I still find go, the horse has got too much energy. You need to get a lower, take it off at 12% and put it on a 10%. Is there any truth to that? Is that just a gross generalization? Because what they're actually talking about is the energy, which is not the percentage.
Yeah, exactly. We get that a lot, and it's something that we don't focus on very much. You know, we're not looking at the energy content. In overseas, a lot of the products are sold on the energy content, and they don't even really mention the protein value at all. So it's something that's in a little bit of a reverse here, and was a bit of a change for me coming from that side to here. But yeah, basically, if we're looking at your protein to energy, generally it will go sort of hand in hand. So for example, if you've got a leisure food with a 10 and 12%, the generalization is that your energy is going to be for leisure horses. So it's going to be a light energy, a low energy feed. If you then move up and you're going to a more 14 or 16%, you're going to probably be looking at horses like stud animals, horses in high performance. And so their energy is going to also need to be higher as well as their protein content. And so generally the protein and energy will go hand in hand, but it's not always the case. Balancers are the best example of that. A balancer is 25% protein, but they are very low in energy. And so generally it does go hand in hand, but not always. And that's something that, you know, we need to look at. And often we get with balancers, people say, oh no, I don't want to add the balancer in, it's too much protein. But they forget that you're going to be using a very small quantity of it. Balancers are designed to be fed in small, minimal amounts. And they really are very low in energy. So generally it should go like that. That's not always the case. So we always say to people, you know, try not to focus on your protein content. As I said before, the majority of the time we're covering our horses' protein needs with our hay and our grazing, especially if those things are good and in vast quantities. So, you know, rather focus on the energy that your feed is designed for. So if your horse is in light to medium work, find a product that is designed with a level of energy designed for light to medium work. And if your horse is in hard work, find one that's designed for hard working horses. Because the other thing that we also as feed companies do is we're also looking at who are we designing the product for. So if the horse is in harder work, the chances are they might need slightly elevated vitamin and mineral needs. For example, maybe, you know, a little bit of difference in terms of your antioxidants and all of that sort of thing. So we're looking at everything as a whole. So when we say this product is designed for light to medium work, we've designed it as such. And that's why it's so important to be realistic about how much work your horse is actually doing, making sure you're not underestimating or overestimating what work he's doing, and then pick a food designed for his workload rather than concentrating on that protein need.
Is there any correlation between protein and energy other than I'm building my horse up, I'm working him more, he's getting fitter, I give him more protein to sustain him, to help him, he gets stronger, his muscles get bigger, he feels better, and he expresses himself more? Is that the correlation? Or I've heard other people saying, is this misinformation that they're not understanding the product, that why don't you give your horse a little bit of balancer, a little bit more protein to up his energy? Or, oh no, I can't top up a balancer because it gets him over the top. He blows his mind.
Yeah, it's difficult to know whether it's individual horses again, whether some of those horses are maybe converting some of the protein to energy because they don't have enough fat, fiber and carbs in their diet, perhaps. Maybe that's why we're getting that reaction. But generally, you know, for me, balances are there to support your muscle and your vitamin and mineral content. They're not there to add in the extra energy. You know, they are there to support that side of things. And if you're looking at, you know, increasing your energy, increasing your general concentrate food would be the best way to go. But, you know, I think sometimes it's also, and not always, but sometimes I think it's a little bit of a perception, is that because it's a high protein product, we're expecting this big reaction from our horses. And that's not always necessarily the case. So, you know, for me, if you're looking for extra energy, going for a higher calorie content is going to be better rather than looking at a higher protein percentage.
Right, now let's talk about feeding and how much to feed, and that again relates to the individual horse and what it needs, and also protein requirements and the age and how much work it's doing. But domesticated horses, we're spending a lot of time in their box. you are going to cause problems with overfeeding of concentrates. Is it a general rule? Keep your per meal servings to under 2 kilos. Is that a general rule? And within that, what can people do? So say they've got a bad doer, and I mean, I've heard of people, oh, he gets 6 kilos. And I go, oh, really? Why is he getting 6 kilos? Why is he not using that? Why is he still a bad doer? So talk us through the process. How much should a horse be getting, and what for bad doers? What can one do to help that without piling on masses and masses of food and causing colic problems?
Yeah. So, I mean, generally, yes, we want to keep it between that 2 and 2.5 kilos, very max per meal size. The horse's stomach size is about the size of a rugby ball. So keeping it around about that 2.5 kilos is about where you want it for the average horse. If we're talking about ponies, obviously it's going to be a little bit less. But keeping meal size small, look, there are some horses that do require larger quantities of food. And for those, as we said before, if you've got that restriction of meal size, it's about giving more meals per day rather than trying to fit it into 2 meals. If you do need to feed larger quantities, then giving 3 or even 4 meals a day is going to be the way to go, because then you can give lots of little small meals. But in terms of amount, again, that's going to be, very individual. But generally for your average horse, you're going to be looking at anywhere between 0.5% of body weight and 1% of body weight maximum in concentrates per day. So for a 500 kilo horse, that's going to be a maximum of 5 kilos, right down to about your 1.5. So it's going to be very variable and going to be very dependent on the horse and how much work, they're doing, and also whether they're a good doer or bad doer. If you've got a horse that's not a particularly great doer, then looking at a product that is perhaps, especially if we're talking about more of a hot horse that's also a bad doer and also a bit hot as well, is looking towards a food that is higher in fat and fiber than sugar and starch, because it allows you to give lots of calories but without the fizz, basically. So if we have a look at oil, for example, a cup of oil gives you the same energy content as about 1.5 kilos of oats. So if we take that volume comparison, you've got 250 mils versus 1.5 kilos. So if you're needing to add extra energy onto a bad doer, but you don't want to overdo the actual amount of concentrate going there, you could add some extra oil into the diet to make sure that you're keeping your volume down, but keeping your calories up. And that's something we often do with horses that, for example, as we've said before, with the ulcers, it's a great technique to use because you can pack in the energy, you can pack in the calories with the fat and not have to use your cereal grains, which can, upset the ulcers and cause further problems there. So with your poorer doers, it is looking at trying to find something that provides calories without getting that temperament over the top. But generally, if you're feeding in the 5 or 6 kilo mark, I often say, and your horse is not doing a lot of work, I always say to people, maybe look at going up at the next energy level up. So for example, if we take a low energy product that's designed for a leisure horse, you're going to get 10 megajoules of energy per kilo. And so if you're feeding 3 kilos, you're going to get 30 megajoules. Whereas if you're looking at a higher energy product and you're getting maybe 12.5 megajoules per kilo, then you can feed less kilos and get the same calorie or more out of that quantity. So you're able to keep your total concentrates down, but keep your calories up. And so that's often the way we go, is rather than adding more and more food of the same thing, is to looking for the next energy level up for the horse if he's not doing so well on the product that you've got him on.
And like you said earlier on, there's normally a correlation between the energy level and the protein level. So you'd be looking at the next protein level up. So just to summarize that point, rather than packing on more and more of the same food, rather feed one food up. It's going to give you within that 1 kilo of food more protein, more energy. Your horse should be able to do better on it, but you're not overloading his system with food.
Exactly.
But I would imagine that your first port of call before you even get there is to say how much forage, how much roughage, what quality grass is the horse on.
Exactly. And that's always the first thing that we go through people is that, you know, if they're coming to us with a horse that, you know, needs a bit more condition, we'll check all of those things out. What's your grazing like? What's your hay like? How much are you feeding? What type are you feeding? Get all of that basic stuff done first. And then we look at where we can go with the concentrates, that we're not overdoing it. So again, you know, when we've been talking today, it's all blanket terms, and there are always horses that fit outside of the norms and that we have to do something different. But that's why we like to go out there. We like to see the horses. We like to do those individual diets. And that's why as a company, we don't charge for the service. We go out, we do free diet consultations, because it's easier when you can see the horse, when you can see the grazing, when you can have that discussion with the owner and go through everything. It's quite difficult to do it over the phone, because often you end up having to give blanket statements about something, and it might not be what's suited to that horse. So it's really a case of if you're not sure what to feed, if you're not getting the most out of your feed, is to contact your brand advisor and ask them for help. They really do know their products inside and out. You know, and you know, I know a lot of the other technical advisors across the companies, and we're all in it for the love of horses. We're not there to push more and more product. We want to get your horse right, and we're not going to advise something you know, that we don't think is suitable. We're all going to choose something that, you know, we feel is going to give you your horse the best chance of success. So it really is about making sure that you get everything right, and ask for help as well. If it's not working, you know, contact somebody to go through your horse and go through every little stage and make sure that it's something that's not being missed out.
When one changes from a food to a food, there's a lot of people, you got to watch out for colics. First of all, what is the reason for that? How quickly can you see the changes from one food to another? Because I know with fats and oils, it takes quite a while for a horse to metabolize, to change its internal systems or structures to be able to metabolize oils or fats to energy. You're not going to see an instant change.
No, you know, for the majority of, I mean, to fully get used to a high fat diet or adding extra fat into the diet, it's going to take about six to 12 weeks, really, max. Generally 6 weeks, more than the 12 side, but some horses take longer than others to start converting fat into energy. Some switch over very easily, some don't. So about 6 weeks. So we always say when you change your food, you know, give it 6 weeks. You know, don't expect to change in 2 or 3 weeks. Sometimes we will see, you know, changes in a short period of time like that, but it's not the norm. So, you know, give it a good 6 weeks. Don't expect that, you know, that change all of a sudden. In terms of time frame to change over, usually between 7 to 14 days. And the reason that we say, you know, give it that period of time is that, especially if you're changing from a brand that's very from one brand to another that's maybe very different in terms of the ingredients that are included. The horse's digestive system has to get used to that. The bacteria that they produce to digest all of these different things needs to adjust and change, and all of that takes time. And if we don't give the horse time to be able to do that, you know, those bacteria, you know, don't react very well, and then you can get your digestive upsets, and that's where the issues come in. So we usually say when you're changing from one brand to another, change over 7 to 14 days. But that also applies to your hay. If you're changing your hay all of a sudden, also do it slowly. If you're changing your grazing and it's a different type of grazing from either one field to the next or yard to yard, take also 7 to 14 days of introducing it slowly so that your horse can get used to those things, and you don't you know, overload the system all in one go.
Coming back to oils, there are oils and then there are oils. There are oils that are low in inflammatory response. There are oils that are high in inflammatory response. There are oils that can really affect a horse's mind. So what oils does a horse get? Again, I pause there because it's very much down to the individual. Yeah. But if you can explain that, those inflammatory, anti-inflammatory, omega-3s, omega-6s, what is the complete oil that I, as a competition rider on competition horses would want?
Yeah, I mean, All oils have the same energy value. So if you're feeding for energy alone, then you could choose any of the oils. They all have the same energy content. So choosing one over the other from that point of view is not going to be any different. But the main difference between all the different oils is your omega-3 and your omega-6 content. Some oils have a much higher 3 than 6 and vice versa. And your omega-3s are generally seen as your anti-inflammatory sort of go-tos. So if you have a horse with maybe an airway issue or a joint issue, you know, going for a diet high in omega-3 is, you know, often ideal. And if you've got a horse that is needing a little bit of extra, it will actually all come down really as well to the type of diet you're feeding. So for example, omega-3 is quite high in your fibers as well. So if you're feeding a lot of grazing or your horse is on a very high fiber diet, the chances are we're going to be meeting those omega-3 those requirements, but we might not be meeting the omega-6. And the omega-3s and 6 work very much in conjunction with each other. So you need a good balance between the two. And so generally the rule of thumb is if your horse has got an issue like joint or feeding a very high fiber diet where you're getting a lot of omega-3, then we might need to look at going for an oil which is high in omega-6. If your horse is needing it for just joints on its own, we might look at going for an omega-3 oil. And so that's generally where the differences will be coming in is what are you needing to use it for? So for example, if we're feeding it for joints, we want that anti-inflammatory response, you're going to be looking towards your linseed. And the one thing that is an amazing omega-3 is actually your fish oils. It's not something that's widely available here. You get cod liver oil in a lot of other countries for horses. And it has an amazing omega-3 response. Here we would be looking more towards your linseed because it's more readily available and has a high omega-3 content. Whereas if your horse is getting quite a lot of fiber and we're thinking that he's probably going to be a bit outweighed in omega-6, then we could look at something like a corn oil or a standard sunflower vegetable oil that will be very high in omega-6s to balance that out. There are a lot of nice oils on the market at the moment that actually have that mix of omega-3 and 6. They've worked out that blend for us and done a nice blended oil. So for the average horse, that's a nice one to go with because you can keep everything within ratio. But generally, we look at adding in a little bit more omega-3s, especially, again, if you're looking at a high concentrate diet. If your horse is not on any concentrates at all, not getting any supplemental food, then the chances are he will need a little bit of omega-6 in the diet. But if your horse is getting 5-6 kilos of concentrate diet, which will generally be higher in your omega-6s, then you're going to want to maybe look at supplementing with an omega-3 to again bring that balance out. So it's all about creating that balance. And it's also why some people use canola oil, because that's also fairly balanced. It's not an exact, but it has a sort of more stable level of omega-3. It's not high or low in one or the other. But generally your fish oils, your linseed oils will be much higher in omega-3, and your corn oils and vegetable oils will be higher in your omega-6.
But once again, it comes down to the individual, and just watch out before you do it. Don't go banging in a huge amount of oil in one go.
Exactly. You know, the one thing... Yeah, and the one thing that a lot of studies have shown is that horses have a sort of set level, and if we get to about the 500 ml mark of oil, which is a lot, it starts affecting the digestibility of the hay that the horse is being fed as well, and it stops them from digesting that as well as it should. So as you say, always be careful of adding in huge amounts extras. Start low and build it up. I mean, if you're looking at feeding oil for a coat condition, for coat shine, then you're not going to need all that much. Between 50 and 150 mils of oil is all you're probably going to need per day. Whereas if you're looking for an energy content, then you're probably going to be looking at between 200 and 350 for the average horse to make that energy difference. So again, it's all about balance. It's also about, you know, making sure you know why you're feeding something before you feed it. You need it. Is there an issue? If there is an issue, then by all means add it in. If there isn't an issue, you know, don't just add it in for the sake of it. Yeah.
Getting back to the evolution of the horse and how it's designed, a lot of people like hay nets, do's and don'ts of hay nets, do's and don'ts of feeding out of mangers as opposed to feeding off the floor. feeding of the floor is the way they are designed to eat. Why is it necessary? Why is it important to try, even in a domesticated environment, to keep them as natural, to hold on to as many of those natural processes as possible?
Yeah, I mean, I think for any animal that we're keeping in a more unnatural state, trying to mimic as much of their natural behavior is always going to be better. You're always going to have a horse that is much more relaxed, who's, feels, that they're getting all of their needs covered, and we're not restricting their natural, instincts and behaviors to come out. We want to try and replicate that as much as possible. We started feeding in hay nets more from a sort of, practical point of view. It allows us to make sure that we're getting it all in. We don't have the wastage. And some horses also, need a hay net. For example, your very good doers, or your little ponies, they will tend to eat and eat and eat, and they'll eat very quickly. So putting in a hay net can slow them down a little bit and can give them hay for a longer period of time, which is what we want. As we said it before, we don't want horses standing for periods of time without anything. But for the most horses, feeding off the floor is absolutely fine. If you've got a horse with respiratory issues, sometimes putting it in a hay net is not a great idea, because as they pull it out of the hay net, you release, some more of that dust and those spores into the air, whereas feeding from the ground allows them to, it doesn't sort of create that, big puff up as it comes out. It also, for horses maybe that have got a weak back, feeding from the ground is great because it encourages that stretching, it encourages that, lower head. It can also help to drain any of those sinuses. If you've got horses with issues, it can help with things like that. So again, it's really individual, but whichever way you can make it work for your horse. Obviously feeding from the ground is more natural, but we've got a lot of nice products now, like the hay bars, for example, where you can still keep it contained, still keep it a little bit more practical, but still encourage that low head, and more natural sort of feeding behavior.
Salivation, when they put their heads down, it activates the salivary glands and just helps with the mastication as well. And you were saying there's a correlation between saliva and ulcers.
Yeah, well, horses, very much unlike humans, they only produce saliva when they chew. So if the horse is not chewing, it's not producing saliva. So if you've got a horse that's got an ulcer issue, you want to be producing that saliva, because the saliva has a acid buffering capacity. It helps to keep that acid content of the stomach down. It then, will help, with a horse with ulcers. So as long as your horse is chewing, there's not a huge, correlation between the amount of saliva produced when the horse is eating off the floor versus a hay net. I'm sure there must be a study somewhere that will say one is better than the other. But for me, I think as long as your horse is chewing, that's the most important part. Keep them chewing, keep that saliva going through, and helping them to buffer that stomach acid is the most important part. So whichever way is more practical for you to do it, as long as your horse is chewing, I think that's the most important part of it. It doesn't matter which way that happens.
To soak or not to soak grass?
So it's a good topic. We covered that on our Facebook page yesterday, so at least that one's fresh in my mind. Again, it depends on why you're soaking your hay. As the main reason for soaking your hay or steaming your hay would be to reduce the dust particles, the bacterial content or spore content of your hay, or to look at reducing the NSC value, or that sugar and starch portion of the hay. So if we are having a look at that, if we're wanting to keep our hay clean, we're wanting to reduce the bacterial content, steaming is the best way to go. Steaming can reduce particles by up to 98%. So steaming is a really good option for horses that maybe have respiratory issues, and we want to make sure that the hay is clean and good for them. If we're looking at a horse where we want to reduce the sugar content of the diet, and we want to reduce that in the hay, soaking is going to be your best option. Steaming doesn't have so much of an effect on the hay, but soaking does. It really helps to leach out that sugar, and can help reduce the content for those horses that need. In terms of time frame, steaming is very quick and easy. It can be done in a short space of a time. And you're soaking, generally, if we're going to soak the hay, we want to look at soaking it for an hour in cold water max, and 30 minutes in hot water. The reason we don't want to soak the hay for too long is if we're trying to reduce the sugar content, if we soak it for too long, we also end up reducing the other vitamins and minerals. We also end up reducing the protein content as well. So we want to also keep a little bit of that nutrient value there. So we want to keep the soaking time short, but also the more you soak your hay, the more dust particles, bacteria, spores that are going to come out and are going to be sitting in that water. So you also don't want your hay sitting in, a large amount of water for long periods of time. So if you are going to soak, 30 minutes in hot water, and 60 minutes in cold. If you can't steam, if you haven't got a steamer and you don't want to get one and you want to still reduce the dust within the hay, then a very short 10-minute soak is all that's required to keep those particles down, to dampen those particles down. For a short 10 minutes is going to be the best way to go.
Is soaking as effective as steaming to reduce spores and for respiratory
compromise? No, it's not. If you've really got a horse with an issue, then going for a steamer is your best way. That's the best way to make sure that you're going to reduce it. Soaking won't reduce it by that much. It will help, but it won't reduce it completely, whereas your steaming will give you a much greater effect. And the same applies if you're trying to soak to reduce the sugar content. Steaming is not going to have all that much of an effect. So soaking is going to be your go-to on that side.
So once again, I just got to reiterate the important 45 minutes to an hour cold water, 30 minutes in hot water. Once you have soaked, remove the grass, or the sugars and the spores are just going to get reabsorbed. Don't use the same water for the next bale. So in other words, you do need to turf that out. It can become a little bit costly with water, and some people might have a problem in a water scarce environment.
Exactly.
Like ours.
So again, going with your steamers can be a good option because they're going to use a considerable amount less water. And it's a big factor for South Africa is that to use as little as water as possible. So, if you need to keep your hay clean, if you want to reduce dust, go for a steamer. It does cost more to start with, but in the long run, you're going to be more environmentally friendly, and it's going to give you a better reduction. If you're needing to soak because of sugar content, then using your water wisely. Make sure you are using a container where you can submerge the hay in as little water as possible. So if you can, maybe you could soak it in terms of slices rather than puffing it up into a big hay net, and then you need a big container of water. Try and do it in slices where you can get away with slightly less water but a bigger coverage. So it's all about sort of using it wisely and using the best technique for what you're trying to achieve. And if you're not looking at either of those options, then thinking about whether do you really need to steam or soak your hay. The one thing that we need to be careful about is that if we are soaking and reducing the sugars, we are also going to reduce the palatability of the hay as well. So some horses might start to not eat so much, and that's going to have an effect. If we steam our hay, the hay often is fresher. Horses often like it more. It increases the palatability of the hay, and the horse ends up eating more, and then is going to be getting more calories, more energy from the hay than it was getting before. So that's also something to bear in mind if you're using those techniques, is to make sure that that's factored into your diet, so that you don't end up with a horse that starts to put on weight because you're now steaming his hay. He likes it more, he's eating more, and then he's getting more calories from that, and you're using your current amount of concentrate. So upping and downing those quantities will make sure that you're not getting too much or too little.
And I think one other point on the soaking, that once you have soaked, you need to feed it straight away. You can't let it stand around the whole day in the blazing sun, soak in the morning and try and feed in the afternoon. You generally will smell that it's starting to turn.
Exactly. And also if you're soaking it for 10 minutes to reduce the dust and then you leave it to dry, you're exposing it to more dust, more pollutants in the air by letting it dry. So feed it, let it drip the majority of the water out, and then feed. If you're feeding it for sugars, you can let it dry out a little bit more. If you're soaking it to reduce the sugars, you can let it dry out a little bit more if the horse prefers it that way. But again, yes, there's no point soaking it in the morning and then feeding it in the afternoon. Try and do it within the time frame that you're actually going to be feeding it, because you open yourself up to that rancidity as well. So yeah. Soak.
Beet pulp, beet fighter, speedy beet, lucerne beet, pros and cons and differences between the two.
The beet products are great products. They're what we call a super fiber. So it means you get more fiber in a smaller quantity. So they're really great at adding fiber into the diet. So they're really useful for horses that either don't need a lot of concentrate foods and you want to, to add something in there. They're really great for supporting poor hay and poor grazing. You can top up your fiber portion of the diet with products like that. The Speedy Beet, generally, I believe it's not one of my products, but it's generally for horses that maybe need a little bit more of a conditioning effect, whereas your fiber beet is there for horses that don't need so much. But between the two, they're not hugely different. The fiber beet contains lucerne as well as sugar beets. That is a consideration for some people. But both are really great products to use to enhance the fiber in your diet. And you can also achieve the same thing with things like, your chaffs and your high fiber cubes. But the nice thing with your beet products is that they're also soaked, so you're adding extra moisture into the diet, which is always good, especially if you've got a horse that struggles with drinking, doesn't always drink so much, struggles with colics and things like that. It can be a nice thing to use by adding extra moisture into the diet.
Would you recommend to everybody that, as a rule, they wet their concentrates down before they feed, or does it depend on what concentrate it is?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, there are some high fiber cubes out there that do need to be soaked. There's some that don't. It will depend on the pellet size. It will depend on the horse as well. Some horses prefer it wet, some don't. If you've got a meal type product, dampening it with a little bit of water just means that you don't leave it able to be blown away. If you're feeding in a field type situation, dampening it can be quite useful. If you've got an older horse with poorer teeth, soaking the meal can be helpful because it helps to sort of soften it up so that they can, take it down more as a mash rather than the actual setup. But really, it's depending on what your horse, needs. For most concentrates, it's not necessary. So if your horse doesn't like it wet, you don't have to. So it's really up to you and a personal preference.
Probiotics, is the jury still out? Some people swear by them. Other studies that I've read quite extensively saying in horses there is little to no effect from probiotics. Where do you stand?
There's lots of great things out there. I'm very one for reading the scientific research, and if a product is backed up by that and has been looked at intensively, I think there's a good place for it. There are some out there that really do work very nicely, but I think the main thing is looking for products that contain the equine strain of bacteria that you're trying to proliferate, and some of them don't. They'll contain something like, for example, a brewer's yeast, which is not equine specific, so it's not necessarily going to help. But for me, supplements are all there as an optional extra, and for me, if you've got an issue, use a product, use a supplement that is there to help with that issue. The majority of supplements out there haven't been tested in terms of a preventative effect. Will they prevent my horse from ever getting this issue? So if your horse doesn't have the issue, is it necessary to feed? Probably not. If your horse has an issue, then absolutely finding something that will help you with that issue is worthwhile.
A dash of Epsom salts in the food. Old school thinking. Necessary, harmful. What's the story?
Again, I think if it's a small amount, it's not going to do huge harm. It depends also. I think it's a more sort of more of a traditional thinking that's kind of not really got its place these days, because the concentrates that we're feeding are so improved. The concentrates that we had 30, 40, 50 years ago are vastly different from what we've got now. We understand more about the horse, we understand more about what it needs, and we're taking in a lot of consideration into the food. And I think that's the important part, is that companies we're here to do a job. We're there to get the most out of your horse. We're there to provide everything the horse needs. We're not there to provide something that doesn't cover those needs. And anything you add in extra to a balanced product is going to imbalance it. So that is the thing for me, is take that into consideration, keep that in mind, and always chat to your technical advisor about adding something like that in first, and how it will balance out with the concentrate and how much you're feeding. We really, as a company at Epol and Equus, we really take great pride in how much care and attention we put into our vitamin and mineral pack and make sure it's there for the horses that the product is designed for. So anything you add in is going to unbalance it if you're using a balanced product. So just always bear that in mind before adding something like that in.
Do you think people generally do too much in trying to help their horses with a bit of this and a bit of that, and eventually your feed room ends up looking like an apothecary with this has got a bit of turmeric and a bit of, you know, all this kind of stuff? Like you say, the balanced feeds nowadays, they take into account everything that you could possibly need. Do we tend to do too much in trying to help? Killing them with kindness?
Yeah, I think we do. Look, we all love horses. That's why we're in this game. You know, nobody's in it, you know, for any other reason. And so I think that the temptation is to say, okay, something's not right. I need to fix it. What can I do to fix it? So we add in a whole lot of things in the hope that something will fix it. And I always, you know, say, be careful with adding things in. Make sure you know what's in it first. For example, if you're adding in a vitamin and mineral supplement onto a concentrated diet, and then you add in, say, for example, something that you think is designed for joints or coats, but they've also added in maybe a little bit of vitamin E or vitamin C, and you've already got that in your concentrate, are you now overdoing it? You know, it wasn't what you chose the product for, but it might be in there anyway. So checking the label, checking in and making sure that it's not going to cause, you know, too much or an imbalance with the rest of the things that you're feeding. And again, that comes down to using your feed companies. You know, everybody knows their products best. Contact the people that are producing your food, discuss the supplements that you would like to use and how that affects with the products that they've got in their range is really the best way to go. But for me, keep it simple. Choose a product that is there for a need. If your horse has a joint issue, feed a joint supplement. But if your horse doesn't have a joint issue, not all of them have been shown to cause a preventative effect. So is it really necessary spending, you know, a huge amount of money on something the horse may not even be using? So, you know, choose wisely, choose what you need, and choose something for a specific issue and not just try and blanket it.
On that, then, how do you feel about balances? I know that balances aren't part of your company. They're generally other products, but
no, we've got balances.
Oh, you're doing a balancer, okay.
We've got, yeah.
So then why would one want to feed a balancer if that generally they refer to it as a vitamin pack? So it's supplementary vitamins and supplementary protein. Why would you be needing to feed that if your feed's already that balanced?
Again, it comes down to the amount that you're going to be feeding. So for example, when we produce a feed, we give a recommended feeding amount. And so for example, for a particular feed, we might say that the recommended feeding amount is 3.5 to 4 kilos. And that means that we are recommending 3.5 to 4 kilos. That's what we feel the horse would need in terms of vitamins, minerals, protein, energy, that amount of product would give you everything you need for your horse. So if your horse is a very good doer and you find you don't need 3 kilos of that product, you're going to be under feeding on your vitamins and minerals because we've, you know, formulated it for a certain amount. So if you're feeding underneath the recommended guidelines of your feed, then going for a balancer is a good way to top up the vitamins and minerals you might be short on, but without adding on the necessary calories, for example, if we're talking about a good doer. If we're looking at our performance horses, some horses work very nicely on, you know, a medium energy food. Their energy levels are great. They're looking fantastic, but they maybe just need a little bit more support in top line. You know, maybe you aren't feeding the recommended feeding amount of your food, but the horse isn't lacking in the energy side, certainly. So you don't necessarily want to up your food to create that little bit of extra effect. So getting the balancer in is, again, a nice way to support the protein levels, give the horse the best chance of building the muscle that they need, and making sure that they're covered from that side of things. And the same applies to maybe a stud animal, for example, where the mare is a very good doer, but her vitamin and mineral needs are going up because she's in, you know, that certain stage of either the pregnancy or lactation, and she needs that extra boost, but she doesn't necessarily need the calories. So the balancers are a nice way of supporting if you're not feeding, you know, up to the recommended levels of products, or if you're not needing to increase your product, but you'd like a little bit of extra support for top line and muscle building and repair.
If we are overdoing things, will the horse just get rid of what it doesn't need? So we're not really going to be harming them, but we will be harming our bank balance. We're probably doing too much in terms of buying things in that we really don't need.
Yeah, exactly. You know, generally it's going to be more our issue. We're going to end up spending more money on things that aren't always necessary. But it also does come back down to the horse. You know, if the horse is having to get rid of a lot of things and excrete a lot of things. That does put extra stress on you know, on your kidneys. If you've got a horse with an issue, that's going to be a problem. You know, you don't want to put extra stress on a horse that's already, you know, having an issue in that regard. So again, you know, the horse will get rid of it, but you know, we've seen from studies where the horse is getting rid of you know, extra things. They're urinating more, that causes more ammonia in your stables. That also can have an effect on your respiratory health. And so again, you know, it's all about balance, like it is with humans. You know, not overdoing it on something, making sure you know why you're feeding it, and you know, use it for a specific purpose.
Finally, ulcers. We have touched on them. Horses are incredibly susceptible to ulcers. Different breeds are more susceptible to ulcers, various causes of ulcers. Stress is a big one, but management also comes into play. So for instance, we see horses, racehorses, for example, and the statistic is horrifying. 95% or something, it could even be higher, of all racehorses will suffer from ulcers. And that goes into both environmental. They're staying in all day. It's a high stress environment, but trainers don't want to feed a huge amount of forage because they don't want horses with big grass bellies, because it slows them down, and the point is to keep them as fast as they can possibly be. The excess gastric juices in the stomach, then when they go out to work, splash up against in an empty stomach and cause ulcers. So we know all this. What can we be? First of all, what do ulcers do to a horse's digestive system? And secondly, more, I suppose, in the sport horse environment, what can we do? You've touched on it a little bit about the Lucerne, but in terms of feeding times and when they would be most susceptible to the splashing around in their stomach, what can we do as preventative remedy?
Yeah, you know, I think a lot of people are very aware of ulcers these days. And I think, you know, even looking at horses that are more high risk, like your race horses, the trainers these days are very aware of that. They know that, and they're, you know, they're very good at managing that correctly and making sure that those horses are being kept as healthy as possible, and they're keeping those ulcers at bay. So people are very used to this now. It's not so uncommon as it was before. And people are generally taking, you know, every step and every measure to make sure their horse is kept comfortable. You know, there are many things that we can do to help with ulcers. Again, we've touched on them before. Keeping that meal size small, making sure we're not overloading the digestive system, which would cause, you know, an issue and a problem there. Making sure that feeding plenty of forage or high fiber type products. So if hay is not an option, you know, for a lot of your performance horses, feeding things like your wheat products, chaffs, high fiber cubes, all of those will have a help. You know, even using a Lucerne cube can, you know, assist with those horses where you don't want the large volumes. So all of those things can help. You know, looking at alternative energy sources for horses that have ulcers. So using higher oil diets. Some you know, racehorses are using that now, is going for a higher oil content so that you can get the calories, get the energy in there without affecting the ulcers, which can be you know, worsened by using a high level of sugar and cereal grains. So you can make small adjustments to the diet to you know, account for that. And generally the biggest times that we see, you know, more flare-ups is, for example, first thing in the morning, where the horse maybe finished his hay late at night. He's been standing for a long period of time without anything going into the gut. They haven't been able to buffer that gastric acid. And you know, the first thing in the morning, the first thing we do is we come in and we put in a bucket of food, you know, and that can also you know, exaggerate the ulcers. So we always say for horses with an ulcer issue, feed some form of forage before you feed your concentrates, to make sure that you know, that forage can be put into the stomach, which sort of almost has a sort of layering effect. It can sort of buffer that acid a little bit by sort of sitting over the top of it and prevent it from splashing it around before we put on the concentrate food. So, you know, keeping that diet nice and balanced, but keeping your fiber levels up, your fat levels up, reducing your sugars and starches, keeping your meal size small, and making sure your horse is never any longer than about 3 hours without anything to be able to chew on, any hay to chew on. And that also goes through to your competition time. Sometimes that becomes a little bit difficult. You know, if we've got a horse that's competing all afternoon, and maybe then has got to travel back home, you know, maybe they're their hay and their food later on in the evening. So really making sure that you're taking stuff to competitions to make sure that as soon as your horse is finished and cool down, that they can, you know, start having something to chew on to help reduce that acid there.
So a good rule for those who do their riding in the morning, make sure that your horse has some sort of forage before you give it concentrates, before you take it out to work. Working on an empty stomach is not a good idea. What do ulcers do to the digestive tract? So a horse that has ulcers, suddenly finding it losing muscle tone, losing weight, its coat goes starey. What is actually at play?
Well, if we've got an ulcer there in the digestive system, it depends on where it is. It also depends on the severity as well, on the reaction we get. Some horses can have ulcers and we don't even know about it. They're very low grade. They're not really affecting the horse in any way, you know, and they don't really show any signs and symptoms. Sometimes as they start showing more drastic signs, then the ulcer severity is a little bit more. And it will essentially come down to the fact that if the horse's digestive system is not happy and healthy, they're not going to be able to digest things that we're putting in there fully and to their best ability. Also, then you've got, you know, an uncomfortable factor, you've got a pain factor on top of that, which can also, you know, cause the horse to lose condition and lose weight as well. So it's really, you know, it's about affecting, I mean, in humans, we know how uncomfortable it is if you've got a stomach ache. It's the same with the horse, you know, and because there's very little they can often do about it, it really comes back to making sure that that gut is happy. And also a horse with ulcers, that gut is not happy. It's not able to function at its best. It's not able to utilize all the things that we're putting in, and that's ultimately going to have an effect on your horse's condition. If the horse can't digest something properly and fully, it's not going to be getting the full amount of protein, the full amount of energy, and therefore his condition, his coat, all of those things are going to suffer. And that's generally the first sign and symptom that we see in most horses.
Horses who are prone to myopathic conditions like tying up, be that because that's a condition that they have or that they're getting a little bit old and suddenly after workouts they're getting a little bit stiff. What in our diet can we recommend? Higher fats maybe?
Yep, again, you know, things like laminitis, Cushing's, insulin resistance, tying up, all of them follow that same sort of principle, keeping your sugars and your starches down, not overloading your system with too much starch and sugar. Providing big meals full of starch and sugar can go into the hind gut, which can cause the bacteria that's designed to break down fiber to die and to not work at its best. And a byproduct of those bacteria not working properly is your lactic acid, which then causes the muscle cramping that we see with tying up. So tying up is very much like those other sort of conditions where we keep the sugar and starch low in the diet, keeping the fat and the fiber high. So definitely, if you've got a performance horse that ties up often and regularly, it's to make sure that we're keeping the sugar and starch content low, but also for those horses, making sure that, you know, that there's a gradual reduction in work. You know, don't go to a competition, work all weekend and then do absolutely nothing on a Monday. That's why it's often called a Monday morning disease, is because it was always a trend that horses were working hard in the fields over the weekend and then did nothing on a Monday. And the same applies with competition. If you want to give your horse a break, absolutely, but a short in-hand walk, extra time out in the field, anywhere where the horse can continue to move and walk is going to be better than just standing still. So if you've got a horse with that, you know, gradual reduction in work and a gradual increase in work is also going to help you with that, as well as making those dietary changes.
You guys offer the service where if people are not entirely sure that they need somebody just coming in and have a look over their feed board and see if they're on the right track. You offer that service. It's a no obligation service. You don't have to be feeding either Equus or Epol to call you guys in. Is that correct?
Absolutely. You know, we're there for the owners, we're there for the horses. You know, we're there to help you get the most out of it. You know, obviously we know our products best. We have all the details of that. You know, so it's often difficult to recommend on other products, but we will do so. If there's a product that you need to use for a particular reason, we will recommend that. So absolutely, it's a free of charge, free obligation service. We can come out to your home, to your yard. You can meet you at competitions if we're having to be at a show. And that's often the reason we go to a lot of the shows, you know, is to be there on hand if people need a help at the show, if they need some guidance, or if it's the easiest time to be able to talk to somebody if you're busy during the week. So absolutely, we will come out. We've got representatives in the majority of the areas throughout the country, and so there's generally a place to be, not a place that we can't get to.
Well, now's a chance for you to give some contact details that people can get hold of you. Is it through email, or is there a website?
We've got a website. We are looking at updating our website. So at the moment, we've got the www.epol.com and www.equusfeeds.co.za. But soon we're going to be, you know, creating one-stop website. So keep an eye out for that. You know, our Facebook page is a great way to contact us. We are looking at it all the time. We're doing a lot of things on Facebook, like our Facebook Lives each Friday afternoon, where we're touching on different subjects. You know, you can contact us through Messenger, WhatsApp, message, you know, give us a phone call, contact us by email, any of the above, you can get hold of one of us.
Right, very quickly to summarize, for somebody who's just getting into the horse game, who doesn't know anything about feeding, 101 feeding for dummies, the things that you really must put in place. Make sure your grass is good quality. Make sure you're feeding enough grass, 5% of the horse's body weight.
1%, 1.5% of body weight.
In forage.
Per day, yeah.
Per day. If we're feeding concentrates, the general rule?
Anywhere between 0.5% of body weight and 1% of body weight per day, which would be 5 kgs maximum. But again, that's going to be very individual. So I'd say for the average horse, you're looking probably at between 1.5 and 3.5 kilos of concentrate, depending on the product you pick. So generally, the rule of thumb is high fiber, so lots of hay, lots of good access to grazing, and keeping your concentrates as minimal as possible to get the most out of it.
And obviously good access to clean and fresh water. Hannah,
Absolutely.
Wonderful chatting to you. Hopefully
Thanks,
that'll
Aidan.
help some people out there. And yeah, best of luck to you guys, and hopefully see you at shows pretty soon.
Yeah, I'm sure we will. Thank you so much for having us on. We really appreciate it. Thanks, Aidan.
Take care. Bye.
You too. Bye-bye.